All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Haley Paul, and I am the Policy Director for the National Audubon Society in Arizona. Thanks for joining us for the finale of our three-part webinar series focused on groundwater in Arizona. Last week, we had the pleasure of hearing from myself and Chris Custis, and we talked about what happens when we overpump groundwater. Today's section is called Tools for Managing Groundwater, Examples from Around the West, where we'll share perspectives and stories about groundwater management solutions that have been implemented in other states, presented by Jocelyn Gibbon of Freshwater Policy Consulting and Rachel O'Connor of the Environmental Defense Fund. And with that, Rachel, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Haley, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am Rachel O'Connor with Environmental Defense Fund, and today I am joined by Jocelyn Gibbon of Freshwater Policy Consulting. We are both a part of the Water for Arizona Coalition. The Water for Arizona Coalition is a community of Arizonans who support innovative practices and smart policies to ensure a reliable water supply to meet the state's needs. Support for the coalition is provided by American Rivers, Audubon Southwest, Business for Water Stewardship, Environmental Defense Fund, and Western Resource Advocates. Collectively, we have over 60,000 Arizona members. Today's webinar is the final in a three-part series covering groundwater in rural Arizona. In the first webinar, we heard from local voices about the importance of groundwater to their communities. In the second, we discussed the impacts of groundwater overuse. If you missed either of these webinars, you can view them by clicking the links that are being dropped in the chat. Today, we'll go over groundwater governance and tools for managing groundwater, looking at examples from other states in the West. I'll start with an introduction to the Arizona groundwater management context and challenges, including a brief recap of what we learned in the first two webinars. Jocelyn will then cover the typical structure of groundwater management systems in the Western United States and some of the choices to be made in deciding what a groundwater management program should look like. We will then share some stories about groundwater choices and management in action, so that you can get a sense of how some of the same issues we're facing here have played out in other states and groundwater basins across the West. And finally, Jocelyn is going to share a bit about the current state-level dialogue and challenges in rural Arizona, including how you might get involved. So let's get started. Groundwater is the water found in the cracks and crevices of soil and rock underground. In Arizona, groundwater accounts for roughly 40% of the state's total water use. Groundwater is the primary and often only water supply available to many rural communities, residents, and businesses. It is the source of year-round flow in most rivers, streams, and springs. In Arizona, groundwater is not regulated across roughly 80% of the state. The overuse of groundwater can create uncertainty and instability. Homeowners' wells go dry, the earth fissures, and ecosystems are put at risk. Groundwater is regulated across about 20% of the state. The 1980 Groundwater Management Act created two types of special groundwater management areas, called AMAs, or active management areas, and INAs, irrigation non-expansion areas. There are currently 5 AMAs, shown here in blue, and 3 INAs, shown in purple. Within INAs, no new acres can be irrigated, and metering of some wells may be required. AMAs have a number of management tools, which Jocelyn will describe in more detail in our Groundwater Management in Action section. Tribal lands are shown in gold. In Arizona, tribes can regulate the use of groundwater on their reservation, but not necessarily protect it. Because groundwater basins do not follow jurisdictional boundaries, groundwater pumping that occurs outside of a reservation can draw down the aquifer levels and impact groundwater availability within a reservation. Rural Arizona, outside of the AMAs, is one of the last places in the Western US where you do not need a state-issued water right or permit to pump groundwater. Groundwater here is governed by the reasonable use doctrine, which allows an overlying landowner to withdraw water and put it to reasonable and beneficial use. Anyone can drill a well to any depth and begin pumping groundwater. They just need to let the state know that they drilled a well. In many other states, groundwater is governed by the prior appropriation doctrine. This is known as first in time, first in right, which essentially translates to first come, first served. Whoever started using the water first has the most secure access to water once supplies dwindle. Under prior appropriation, groundwater users are required to obtain a water right from the state and generally cannot pump water if it impacts availability to other users with a more senior water right. The status quo approach to groundwater in rural Arizona is, in essence, whoever drills the deepest well wins, even if that pumping dries up neighboring wells, depletes nearby streams, or causes subsidence and fissures. The Water for Arizona Coalition believes it is time for the state to empower communities in rural Arizona with the choices, tools, and support they need to secure their water future. We put this webinar series together to hear about the importance of groundwater to rural communities across the state, discuss the negative impacts of groundwater overuse, and to examine the choices other states have made around groundwater management and what those opportunities present for Arizona. In our first webinar, we heard from a panel of prominent leaders from across rural Arizona. The panelists discussed the value of groundwater and what it provides to their communities, the challenges they face in managing the resource sustainably, and what types of solutions they think are needed. I'll give you a moment to read some of their quotes. Aaron Young, not quoted on the slide, summed things up with, "Once it's gone, it's too late." In the second webinar, our Water for Arizona Coalition colleagues discussed the impacts of groundwater overuse that are being seen across the state. For example, in the Wilcox area in southeastern Arizona, the groundwater table has declined rapidly from increased pumping over the last decade. There has been significant land subsidence and large fissures in the region, and reports of residential wells going dry. Around the Verde River, groundwater pumping has dried up important springs that provide water flows to the river. In the Kingman area, community water supplies are at risk. These consequences have led to a recent dialogue around whether something else is needed in Arizona and what can be done. Jocelyn is now going to discuss some of the choices we can make around groundwater management, governance, and tools.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. Thanks for taking the time to join us today and for this series. So I'm going to talk about how groundwater law is usually structured and the kind of choices that go into it. This part might feel a little bit abstract, but we hope to convey how these choices truly affect our landscapes, our communities, and our opportunities on the ground. So first, structure. Groundwater law is usually state law, not federal or local law. There's always a backdrop of state law that applies across the state. As Rachel described, that's the reasonable use doctrine in Arizona, which in practice essentially means anything goes. She also told us that in many other states, there's a system of groundwater rights and permits that applies across the state, including in all of the states that have cross-hatching on the map here. But then regardless of the background law in a state, Western states also typically allow for special management areas, which are the colored areas here on the map, where there's opportunity for additional locally specific groundwater management. So state law basically says, here, this is the overall law about groundwater, but then in particular circumstances, a special management area can be created. And here's how and what is required or possible in a special management area. Here's how one works. This structure allows groundwater policies to be locally specific and adaptable, since groundwater conditions are often very locally unique. but those locally specific policies are authorized by the state within a statewide framework and can get state support. This map shows special management areas, again, the colored areas, in each Colorado River Basin state. The boundaries of these areas are usually set up to coincide with those of groundwater basins, so they allow for specific rules governing specific basins. And if you've never seen it before and are curious, here's a map of Arizona's groundwater basins. The copper colored lines are county borders, and then the blue ones are the outlines of the state's different groundwater basins and subbasins, the lighter blue lines. So special management areas usually have a particular goal or goals, often called management goals. A goal can be to achieve some kind of steady state, such as where withdrawals match water that's recharged. That's essentially the goal for 3 of Arizona's AMAs and is called safe yield in our state. The goal could also be to slow depletions over time, to avoid certain undesirable results, or to, for example, preserve a particular industry, economic use, or protect an important resource like a river or a spring, or it can be some combination of these things. In Texas, there is a list of management goals that every local district must address. So there's usually a goal, and often there's a requirement to create a management plan for the area. The state sometimes crafts the plan itself through a state agency, and sometimes delegates that authority to a local council or board, or there can be cooperation and interplay between the two. So that's often the general structure and shape of how groundwater is managed in Western states. A background state law and then state authorization of local management areas. But within this general shape, there are lots of choices to be made and that have been made by different states and for different basins. We can divide up these choices into 2 main buckets. There are choices and questions about governance. How is one of these areas governed? How are decisions about local groundwater management made? And there are lots of choices about tools and programs. What kinds of strategies, requirements, incentives, and programs are actually used to manage groundwater to meet the stated goal? What does the toolbox look like? So governance and tools. I'll say a little bit more about each now before we start to get into the examples. So first, what is governance? The dictionary defines it as overseeing the control and direction of something. It's about how decisions are made and who gets to make what decisions. One of the significant questions about groundwater governance in this case is, as I've alluded to, how do state and local government work together? We said special management areas are provided for under state law, but then they allow for local input. How much? How does that work? What locals have a say? Which level of government makes which decisions? And who has what responsibilities? This is an important set of governance choices. Let's go to the next slide. There are also, of course, questions about, okay, so what actually applies in these areas or is allowed to apply? What are the tools? And when you survey all of the different legal frameworks and the range of management plans around the West, you find that there's a pretty large set of possible tools. Our coalition has created a document where we categorize and describe different tools for local groundwater management. We're not going to go through each one today, but here's the list of the categories of tools that we've identified. And then we're going to share with you some of these tools in action while we tell you about how things have worked, or in some cases not worked as well in different basins and states. So the categories include tools that we call those that set the stage. So things that are related to how the area can do planning in a basin. Tools that require or encourage conservation among users or different sets of users or different types of uses. Then tools that allocate the available resource and allow for transfers. We sometimes call these allocative tools. Tools that allow and encourage reuse and replenishment of water. Those that help areas plan and manage water in an integrated way with connected land uses. And finally, tools that help other tools work better. So financial, educational, and informational tools. So for this next section, we're going to get into some of the details and stories about how groundwater has been managed in different places in the West. And as we do a little disclaimer, we want to acknowledge that Rachel and I haven't worked in each of these places. So if you have, please forgive us if we've missed some of the nuance. And of course, we also need to say that none of this is legal advice. So before we start exploring too far from home, let's start with a bit more context about our own state. We thought it would be useful to review a little more about AMAs in particular, so that you can compare and contrast that with other examples, and perhaps gain a greater understanding for why some people have been advocating for a new alternative to AMAs that might be more readily adopted and embraced in rural areas. So the first AMAs were created by the Groundwater Management Act itself in 1980. The director of the Department of Water Resources can create a new one upon making certain findings. And a new AMA can also be created by local voters by filing a petition that triggers an election. This hasn't happened so far in Arizona. No new AMAs have been created since the 1980s, except that the Tucson AMA was split to create the Santa Cruz AMA. There is, however, currently a local petition being circulated in Cochise County to propose the creation of a new AMA in the Wilcox and Douglas groundwater basins. If enough signatures are gathered, voters in these basins can vote come November whether to adopt an AMA. And sorry, that's not this November, but the following. Every AMA has a management goal. While the current AMA's goals were all established by the legislature, if there were to be a new AMA, the director of the Department of Water Resources would define the management goal right after it was created, after the AMA was created. The director implements and enforces AMA programs and requirements. Every AMA has a 5-member Groundwater Users Advisory Council appointed by the governor. This local council has a purely advisory role. AMAs are largely governed at the state level. And as Rachel shared with you, the only other option in Arizona for groundwater management framework for a basin is an irrigation non-expansion area, or INA, which is only applicable in rather limited circumstances. So in an AMA, certain programs and requirements automatically apply. For those of you who listened in to last week's webinar, you already heard a little bit about these AMA tools, but we're going to go through them briefly. Within an AMA, groundwater users need a water right or other permit or authority to use groundwater, unless they are pumping from a smaller well, what we call an exempt well. Within an AMA, there are also rules that govern the allowable spacing and impact of new wells. No new irrigation is permitted on lands that weren't irrigated prior to the creation of the AMA. Director of the Department of Water Resources also creates a new management plan every decade tied to the AMA's management goal. The plan must contain conservation requirements for those who use groundwater. The Assured Water Supply Program governs new subdivisions. And finally, there's a program for storing water underground and accruing credits to use that water again at a later date. It's worth pointing out that the AMAs use mostly regulatory tools, basically rules about what people can and can't do, versus what we call allocative tools, which are ones that basically give people rights to use the resource and then let them trade and transfer those rights within a set of constraints and guidelines. Also, some of these tools are fairly novel and unique to Arizona. So AMAs certainly have their strengths and weaknesses. They have been credited with slowing the rapid decline in groundwater levels that predated the Groundwater Management Act. They have also been critiqued for some of the gaps that have made achieving and then maintaining the goals for the AMAs challenging and even impossible in some of the AMAs. AMAs also don't really address connections between groundwater and surface water. And when the possibility of creating new AMAs has been discussed, to the extent that it has been discussed in Arizona, the point has often been made that the AMA structure is very prescriptive in nature, rather than flexible or adjustable to meet the needs of different places. For example, the irrigation non-expansion requirement and other programs automatically apply in an AMA, whether or not that's considered locally appropriate. For these and other reasons, many people don't see AMAs as the ideal solution to challenges in at least some parts of rural Arizona. So just a few takeaways here about AMAs. We've basically never made a new one. Each one has a specific management goal. Most decision-making and control rests with the state agency. There's a fixed set of programs that automatically apply within the AMA with their details prescribed by statute. ADWR does create basin-specific management plans with conservation requirements for each AMA. And there's a unique tool set made up of mostly regulatory style tools. And I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to continue our tour.
Thanks, Jocelyn. So moving on over to Kansas. Parts of Kansas, particularly the area that overlies the Ogallala Aquifer, which is shown in the thick black outline. These areas have seen really precipitous declines in the groundwater table. On the map shown here, the darkest red indicates a decline by over 100 feet in just 25 years. The groundwater decline in the Ogallala Aquifer is among the most severe in the world. In Kansas, both surface water and groundwater rights are regulated under the prior appropriation doctrine, that first come, first served idea. The special management areas in Kansas are called Groundwater Management Districts, or GMDs. Local water users can petition to form a GMD, defining the district area and purpose of the GMD. The petition is reviewed and approved by the chief engineer of the state's Water Resources Division. Once formed, GMDs are governed by locally elected boards of directors. GMDs must prepare and adopt a management program that will guide district operations according to defined goals. Kansas law also establishes certain designations that allow for additional management measures to address groundwater declines. Intensive groundwater use control areas empower the chief engineer to take additional management actions to control excessive groundwater declines. This could involve restricting existing water rights based on prior appropriation rules. Of note is that some areas have avoided seeking this designation because of a fear that the chief engineer could impose substantial reductions in groundwater pumping with limited flexibility or input from local water users. Conversely, locally enhanced management areas enable local water users to develop their own management plan to reduce groundwater use. Those within a LEMA can choose from a variety of tools to achieve their management goals. The plan is submitted to the chief engineer, who then oversees and enforces it. In Kansas, there are different tools available at different management levels. At the state level, the Division of Water Resources administers water right permits and can adopt rules and regulations. State level management actions can include measuring and reporting, conservation plans for new water uses, reduction of water rights by priority date, and water banking. Groundwater management districts can utilize other types of tools, so long as they're consistent with Kansas's water appropriation laws. Districts can construct and operate recharge, storage, or importation facilities, create demonstration projects and conduct research and share data and technical information, require metering and reporting, and recommend rules and regulations. Additional management tools are available within locally enhanced management areas, or LEMAs. Water users can decide to set a management goal and create a plan. They can close the area to new groundwater uses. They can set a total cap on groundwater withdrawals. And they can implement a variety of other measures to reach management goals, things like water efficiency improvements or creating flexibility within irrigation allocations. So now on to management and action. The Sheridan 6 LEMA, Locally Enhanced Management Area, was designated in 2013 and is one of the first in the state. To address groundwater declines within the LEMA, they set a management goal of reducing the amount of water pumped by 20%. This was achieved largely through improving irrigation efficiency and switching to lower water use crops. There was significant uncertainty and consternation and skepticism within the wider farming community. But the results showed that over the 5-year time period, farmers ended up decreasing their water use by 31%. The reduction in irrigation did end up in smaller harvests, but the money farmers saved on their energy bills by pumping less water was 4 times more than the amount of money they lost due to decreased production. Prior to the Lima, water levels in the area were declining as much as 2 feet per year. Now they're only dropping by about 4 inches. I think that there are several important takeaways looking at Kansas. First, they have several types of opt-in management with different tools available for each type of management designation. Management can either be state-driven or locally driven. It's important to note that there's trepidation around state-driven approaches due to the uncertainty and lack of control over the outcomes. But locally driven management has been slow to adoption as some are hesitant of change and prefer the status quo. Ultimately, though, as the example demonstrated, locally driven management can be effective at reducing groundwater pumping so long as there is local buy-in.
Okay, so now we're going to move on over to Texas. I went to law school in Texas, and as a matter of fact, when I was a student, I was involved in helping some local residents create a new groundwater conservation district. That's the name for special management areas in the Lone Star State. There are currently 98 groundwater conservation districts, or GCDs, in Texas, which are shown here in the colors on the map. In Texas, the background legal doctrine for groundwater use is called the rule of capture, which means essentially that one may pump groundwater in any amount for any purpose. However, in Texas, as you saw in the last slide, groundwater conservation districts have been created across much of the state to allow for local management of the resource. They can be created in a few ways. Either the legislature can simply create a new one in a particular area, or there's a process for a local petition and election. A petition to create a GCD must be signed by a majority of local landowners, or in larger districts, at least 50. An election is then held to approve the creation of the district and elect permanent directors. Once a local board is in place, it has quite a bit of authority to manage groundwater within the district. Texas districts are somewhat unique in that they are authorized to actually create groundwater rules that apply within their district and to implement them. So this is much more than an advisory role, as in some places. Depending on the funding available to it, a GCD in Texas may even often have its own staff, for example. Another unique requirement in Texas is that GCDs plan together regionally. The legislature has established a joint planning process that districts must use to work together to define what are called desired future conditions for a region, and that are then integrated into each district's planning processes. So here are some of the different options for management tools that various Texas districts have adopted. GCDs may define what kinds of groundwater uses or wells require a permit and set permit standards and conditions. They can impose a production allowance, which is an amount of groundwater that users may withdraw annually. Many have well spacing rules to minimize interference or localized impacts. Priority management zones can also address localized concerns. One good example of these things in action is the Hayes Trinity GCD in Hayes County, Texas, which is southwest of Austin and is one of the fastest growing counties in the US. EDF recently completed a set of case studies that includes this district. Groundwater here is both a source of public and domestic water supply and the flow of cherished springs and streams. There are some really beautiful spring-fed watering holes in the Texas Hill Country. Groundwater in the Trinity Aquifer in this area supports Jacob's Well, which is the thing shown on the slide here. And Jacob's Well itself provides flow to Cedar Creek and Blue Hole, tourist destinations that bring in tens of millions of dollars in revenue. The Hayes Trinity GCD was created to address severe groundwater declines and projections that demand for groundwater would exceed availability within 50 years. More recently, despite the GCD designation, concern grew about continued depletion of groundwater and periodic drying up of both drinking water wells and Jacob's well. The local GCD board tackled these concerns by first creating a scientific committee to better understand local conditions, especially related to Jacob's well. The committee found that groundwater from one specific area flowed to Jacob's well, and so recommended creating a management zone to more effectively manage groundwater in that area. After vetting the scientific committee's recommendations with local residents through a stakeholder task force, the GCD board adopted new rules, which included creating a new management zone, prohibiting new groundwater permits in the zone in most cases, and instituting drought rules that reduce pumping in the zone when certain triggers are met. Experts at EDF have pointed to the importance of these decision-making processes in creating and getting buy-in for the new rules, and also the importance of reliable funding sources for the district to be able to implement these and other activities moving forward. Overall, in summing up the Texas story, here are a few takeaways. Groundwater is mainly managed through local districts in Texas, and most of the decision-making authority rests with the local board, usually elected, so there is a state prescribed framework. Local GCD boards make and enforce groundwater rules, which can include things like new permit standards and pumping rules. And there is a joint planning process for regional coordination. Overall, there's a lot of local control and discretion available in the Texas option and a broad set of tools available to choose from. But then there's also been a challenge in making sure the districts have enough resources, including financial resources, to effectively employ that local control. Back to Rachel.
Thanks, Jocelyn. As we continue our tour, we're now going to stop at Utah. So Utah is the second driest state in the nation, as well as the fastest growing state. In Utah, groundwater accounts for about 25% of the state's total water supply. But as the population continues to increase and climate change impacts surface water availability, groundwater is likely to play an increasingly important role. Utah water law is governed by the doctrine of prior appropriation, as we've seen with many of the states, with both groundwater and surface water treated as one. New water users must file an application with the state engineer. Water right areas in Utah are categorized as open, restricted, or closed, depending on the availability of water. In areas that are open, which are shown here in green on the map, a new water user can apply for a new water right. In closed areas, shown in red, a new water user must acquire an existing water right and file a change application to cover the new use. In restricted areas, shown in yellow, there are special restrictions that apply. For example, new small domestic uses are allowed, but larger new uses require a change application. Groundwater management plans add an additional layer of management. Utah statute requires that the withdrawal of water from a groundwater basin be limited to the basin's safe yield, and that the state engineer adopt a groundwater management plan before enforcing that limit. Safe yield essentially means that the amount of water that is pumped out of the ground should equal the amount of water that is recharged into the ground. The state engineer is authorized to adopt a groundwater management plan for any groundwater basin or aquifer. The engineer is required to adopt a management plan if more than 1/3 of the water right owners in the basin request the adoption of a plan. The objectives of each groundwater management plan are to 1, limit groundwater withdrawals to safe yield, 2, protect the physical integrity of the aquifer, and 3, protect water quality. The blue dots on the map show areas with groundwater management plans. If withdrawals within a basin consistently exceed safe yield, a state engineer may designate the basin as a critical management area. The designation of a groundwater management plan occurs at the state level. Once established, the state engineer can close the basin to new water users if the basin is not in safe yield. The state engineer can then regulate based on priority date, which means that junior water users may lose access to water if supplies diminish. Change applications are one tool to allow for new uses in a closed basin. Within groundwater management plan areas, there are several tools available, including well spacing, change applications, limiting groundwater withdrawals, and requiring metering and reporting. Local water users have the option to participate in a voluntary arrangement for managing withdrawals within a basin. Voluntary arrangements open up opportunities, but have also been found to raise some difficult questions, as we'll see in a moment. Within a critical management area, in order to achieve safe yield, local districts can acquire and retire groundwater rights and may levy assessments for planning and water right acquisition. They can also acquire surface water rights and use the surface water for groundwater recharge. Beryl Enterprise in southwestern Utah is an example of a Utah critical management area that has adopted a groundwater management plan. The area has relied heavily on groundwater for irrigation since the 1940s, leading to overdraft, groundwater level declines, and subsidence. The local community there spent years developing voluntary arrangements that would reduce pumping and overdraft through gradual and proportional reductions in groundwater use. Stakeholders were concerned that if the basin was regulated by prior appropriation by priority date, that thousands of acres would be taken out of production all at once and hundreds of users would be cut off entirely. This would potentially have devastating impacts to the local community. In the end, they were unable to formalize a workable voluntary arrangement. This is partly because of inconsistencies with the existing water law and partly because of the voluntary nature of the arrangement. Instead, the state engineer adopted a management plan for the area. The plan sets up a depletion schedule to achieve safe yield by the year 2130, gradually reducing depletions of the groundwater system. Reductions are based on priority dates of water rights, meaning that junior users will need to forego pumping or acquire more senior water rights. So for some takeaways, Utah statute requires that the withdrawal of water from a groundwater basin be limited to the basin's safe yield. Areas across the state are designated as open, restricted, or closed to new water uses. The designation of groundwater management plans can be either state-driven or driven by local water users. And in areas with the groundwater management plan, both the state and local districts have a unique set of tools. And now I'll pass it back to Jocelyn.
Thank you. So now our tour is going to head over to Nevada. Nevada is highly groundwater dependent. Although Las Vegas relies heavily on the Colorado River, most of the rest of the state uses groundwater. It makes up about 46% of the state's water supply in a given year. Nevada's special management areas in color here are called designated basins. And then Diamond Valley, which we're going to talk about in the red, is also a critical management area. The state adheres to prior appropriation again for both surface water and groundwater. So to use either kind of water, you need to get a water right with a priority date. Nevada has a state engineer who oversees Nevada's 256 groundwater basins and is given very broad authority to regulate groundwater extractions. The state engineer may also designate a basin when it is in need of what Nevada law calls further administration, usually due to overallocation. Then a critical management area is a groundwater basin where groundwater withdrawals consistently exceed the perennial yield of the basin. Diamond Valley is Nevada's first and so far only critical management area. In a critical management area, local water users are given 10 years to develop and agree to a management plan for the basin. If they don't, the engineer is required to start curtailing groundwater uses. The local plan must be agreed to by the majority of local water users and approved by the state engineer. After it's approved, the engineer is largely responsible for implementation and enforcement. So it's kind of interesting that in Nevada, the state is given almost complete control over groundwater basins without much formal local role until an area is designated as a critical management area. But then at that point, the local users get a great deal of latitude in developing their own management plan. So what are the management tools? The state engineer starts with broad authority. The engineer is required to regularly assess whether each basin is achieving perennial yield. Again, similar to safe yield in the states we've talked about. And it may not issue a new groundwater permit in a basin once perennial yield is reached. That's statewide. In designated basins, and remember there were lots of those on the map, the engineer gains even broader control. If the basin is being depleted, the law says he can make such rules, regulations, and orders as are deemed essential for the welfare of the area involved. So the way it looks in Nevada is that you can go onto the state engineer's website, look up your basin, and be linked to a set of special rules and orders that will apply to groundwater use in that basin. There may be limits on certain types of pumping or new permits or a set of preferred uses within the basin. We noted that in critical management areas, the local community is given an opportunity to craft a solution to serious overdraft. It turns out that what is legally permitted in these local solutions is up for debate, as we'll see next. So Diamond Valley is in rural north central Nevada. It became a critical management area in 2015 in response to groundwater level declines of up to 2 feet per year, as well as springs drying and impacts to senior water rights. Locals in Diamond Valley spent years working to develop a local management plan approved by the state engineer in 2019. The plan was in effect briefly, but shortly after it was approved, it was challenged in court. Though it hasn't been given much of a chance to work yet, it's an interesting plan. It includes 8 different management goals. Each groundwater user in the basin receives what they call a groundwater share. Different users' shares are larger or smaller, depending on the size and the priority of their existing water right. Every year, a share is assigned a specific volume of water, and overdraft is reduced over the years by gradually decreasing the amount of water associated with each share. Unused shares can be leased to others in a given year. Although most locals support and are invested in this plan, a few of the more senior users objected to it, claiming that because it spreads cuts among all the different users, it strays too far from the prior appropriation doctrine. They sued, arguing that because state law doesn't specifically authorize a program like this, it's not legal. A court struck down the plan in April of 2020, but the decision is currently being reviewed by the Nevada Supreme Court. After the effort that went into it, the local plan has some passionate defenders. So a few takeaways from Nevada. The state has broad authority over groundwater and does not issue new permits if they will exceed a basin's perennial yield. Though typically there's not much of a local role, in critical management areas, local users can develop a local plan to address overdraft. The Diamond Valley plan illustrates how a system of groundwater shares could work to spread the burden of reducing pumping and allow for trading among the different shareholders. So this is one of the more allocative style tools. We also see here how the lack of specificity in state law allowed for local innovation, but then also raised legal questions about exactly how much innovation is actually authorized. Rachel?
Thanks, Jocelyn. We're going to cross state lines now over to Oregon. And many think of Oregon as a water-rich place, but significant portions of the state receive less than 20 inches of precipitation a year, and that's about double what Phoenix sees. So groundwater is a really important resource to serving the state's municipal, agricultural, environmental, and cultural needs. Several basins within Oregon are facing issues of overuse. Oregon's surface water and groundwater are both governed by the prior appropriation doctrine. The state has also created several types of special management areas that have different levels of restrictions and protections. For example, if there are significant groundwater declines in an area, it can be designated a critical groundwater area, which then allows for the restriction of current and new uses in order to stabilize the groundwater table. In serious water management problem areas, water use measuring devices are required. In 2015, the state authorized place-based planning, granting 4 communities across the state funding to support local planning and management efforts. Each of these communities is required to work through a 5-step process, but can do so in a way that is individually tailored to the unique circumstances of their region. The 5 steps include to first, build a collaborative and integrated process. Second, characterize water resources, water quality, and ecological issues. Third, quantify existing future needs and demands. And fourth, develop integrated solutions for meeting long-term water needs. And lastly, to adopt the plan. Each of the places is able to determine a unique plan and set of tools to implement in order to meet the long-term needs of their community. However, the state requires that the plans must be developed in collaboration with a balanced representation of interests from the region, balance current and future in-stream and out-of-stream needs, include the development of actions that are consistent with existing state laws, facilitate implementation of local solutions, be developed utilizing an open and transparent process that fosters public participation, and be developed in consultation with the Water Resources Department. There are several tools that stakeholders can choose to incorporate into their plans to meet management objectives. These tools include efficiency and conservation measures for agricultural, municipal, and industrial water users, multi-purpose storage that optimizes in-stream and out-of-stream public benefits, maintaining natural storage like forests and meadows, water right transfers to move water from where it is needed or to provide mitigation, implementing reclaimed water to augment supplies, modernizing infrastructure, supporting in-stream flow needs for ecosystem health and public benefit, and measuring and monitoring. Oops, sorry, I lost my place here. 1 second. There we go. So I think that there are some valuable insights to gain from looking at Oregon's place-based planning, but it is a relatively new program. So I wanted to provide an example of one of the other special management areas, the groundwater mitigation area. In the 1990s, a groundwater study was conducted in part of the Deschutes Basin in Central Oregon. The study found a strong hydraulic connection between surface water and groundwater, and that groundwater withdrawals would impact surface flows. As a result, the state created the Deschutes Groundwater Mitigation Program, which provides a set of tools to allow for new groundwater uses. Groundwater mitigation is a kind of tool that is also referred to as offsets. Simply, someone who wants to drill a well to pump groundwater needs to find a way to offset their groundwater use so that their groundwater pumping would not detrimentally impact surface water flows. There are many authorized ways to generate these mitigation credits, which can then be sold to offset new groundwater development. This includes the retirement of surface water rights, aquifer recharge, storage releases, or temporary leases from conservation. In the Deschutes, there are several entities that are statutorily authorized to facilitate the sale and purchase of mitigation credits. The mitigation program is reviewed every 5 years by the Oregon Water Resources Department with input from stakeholders in the basin. Oregon has several special management area designations that are controlled by the state. This provides some flexibility in applying the type of management that is most needed in a particular basin. The state's place-based planning, which is statutorily authorized, is a comprehensive planning process that requires shared learning and decision-making and allows local stakeholders to develop a locally tailored management plan. The Deschutes Groundwater Mitigation Program utilizes offsets as a tool so that there can be new groundwater uses without impacts to stream flows or to other users. The state provides significant funding and technical resources to support these programs. Now I'll pass it back to Jocelyn.
Thanks. So before wrapping up our tour, we wanted to stop for just a moment and further highlight the groundwater mitigation or offset tool. The concept of offsets is one that comes up in many groundwater management structures around the West. The terminology varies. Sometimes it's called groundwater mitigation, sometimes augmentation. But in various basins, there are requirements that all or just certain new groundwater users must do something to offset or mitigate or otherwise make up for their impacts, usually defined as impacts on a nearby river, stream, or other surface water supply. There are augmentation, mitigation, or offset programs and requirements in different groundwater basins in Oregon, as you just heard, Washington State, Colorado, Montana, and New Mexico. Though there's not time to get into a lot of detail today, we also wanted to just mention that here in Arizona, I actually got to be part of a local group in the Verde Valley that began to explore the concepts of offsets in the Arizona context by creating a program called the Verde River Exchange. The exchange, which is run by Friends of the Verde River, is an all-voluntary program where groundwater users who are interested in reducing or offsetting their water footprint, so to speak, can choose to purchase water offset credits generated through various conservation actions, also implemented with voluntary participants. The program was inspired by looking at some of what has been done in other places and by the observation that an offset mechanism can be an effective way to stabilize groundwater levels and protect surface water, while, as Rachel pointed out, still allowing for new growth and development and changing uses. It was meant to help inspire and even enact proactive, collaborative water solutions in the Verde area, the exchange was. We've put the exchange website into the chat if you want to learn more about that. So now we're gonna start wrapping up and talk about how these stories and takeaways might be relevant to the conversation here in Arizona today. If you've been with us through this whole webinar series, you've heard about some of the increasingly urgent concerns that local leaders have around their groundwater supplies. And you've also heard a recounting of some of the things we're witnessing, including wells going dry, groundwater levels declining, impacts to rivers and streams, and threats to community water supplies in different parts of the state. You've also heard that local communities have very few tools to address these challenges. Local cities, towns, and counties generally don't have a great deal of authority over water unless the legislature specifically gives it to them. We've had no new AMAs since the early 1980s. Many commentators have argued that an AMA is not the right fit for rural Arizona. As a result, the conversation in Arizona has often been very binary. Either you can create an AMA, or if you believe that's not the right fit, then you can do nothing. There have been a few efforts in various parts of Arizona to ask the state to authorize new types of special management areas or authorities for local communities. For the most part thus far, these efforts have also met with obstacles. But over the last several years, as challenges become more intense and more visible, we have seen a shift in the conversation with more discussion about whether something new is needed. At the legislature in 2019, Representative Regina Cobb from Kingman introduced a bill which passed and established study committees for Mojave and La Paz counties in the western part of the state, if you're not from Arizona, Northwest, to gather data about groundwater conditions and make recommendations to the legislature. Then in 2020 and 2021, there were bills introduced to extend groundwater protections to areas in Arizona that currently have none. One bill would have changed the process for creating new INAs. Another bill would have allowed a county board of supervisors to opt into what has been named a rural management area, or RMA, which would be a new management option. RMAs don't currently exist. Ultimately, these bills were only heard for information purposes in 2020 and were not voted on. This last year, there was again a lineup of bills, including these two, and unfortunately, again, none received a committee hearing or opportunity for debate. Representative Cobb has said in public forums that she will be reintroducing some form of both the INA and RMA bills this coming session. So what is an RMA? It is yet to be fully determined, since, as I said, thus far it's just a concept. But as structured in Cobb's 2020 and 2021 bills, County boards of supervisors in rural areas could opt in to create an RMA in basins or subbasins that are considered to be at risk, and thus authorize creation of local plans to manage, protect, and conserve groundwater in regions outside of AMAs, the existing AMAs, excuse me. Under the 2021 bill, an advisory council of local citizens would be appointed by the governor, and that council would establish management goals and a management plan for the area. Plans would be approved by the Department of Water Resources before taking effect. The available management tools or best management practices are not described in detail in the current bill or the previous bill, but include voluntary and mandatory conservation programs, measuring and reporting requirements, and incentives for recharge. The Water for Arizona Coalition, whom Rachel and I both work with, believes that RMAs could be an important and innovative step forward, potentially creating a new special management area for Arizona, one that allows communities to pursue locally driven water planning, promote water security, and make choices to ensure they have a good economic future. We also believe, based in part on the kinds of case studies and lessons learned that we've discussed today, that there are some policy considerations that this RMA concept raises and that should be thought through carefully and robustly debated. For example, how will the state support RMAs? How should the advisory councils be established? What exact programs and tools should councils be able to select from? So those governance and tools questions we talked about. As we consider RMAs or other groundwater management tools in Arizona, here are some lessons learned for Arizona that we think can be taken from our tour around the West. First, just the way things are structured, that usually the state creates a framework for local groundwater management, but that can be set up to meet local needs. It's also important to allow a good balance in decision-making and in providing resources so that you get both state support, but also local input. The more responsibility you give to a local council, as in Texas or Kansas or Nevada's critical management area, the more you also need to think about how the local council is established and resourced. We hope we've given you a good overview of some of the kinds of things that can then be done to manage groundwater. There's an array of tools, and truly different ones make sense for different places and situations, whether that's irrigation efficiencies to conserve groundwater in Kansas, a system of shares to slowly reduce groundwater use in a critical basin in Nevada, a geographic zone to protect spring flows in Texas, or a system of offsets in the Deschutes to better integrate surface water and groundwater protection. A final takeaway is that local management areas need appropriate financial resources and also clarity in the law about their responsibilities and authorities. But perhaps the most important point that we hope you'll take away from today and this series is that there are increasingly urgent challenges around rural groundwater, that increasingly there are calls for solutions, and that solutions are possible. Looking around the West, we see that while there are all kinds of variations, states and local stakeholders have crafted an array of solutions to very similar challenges. Given the importance of this discussion for the future of our state, our coalition is working to help support and provide resources to those who are facing challenges and engaging on these issues. We want to encourage anyone who is interested to get involved because it's going to take real engagement by leaders and residents in rural Arizona to develop the right solutions and persuade our state decision makers of the need for these solutions. We will put in the chat 2 important upcoming opportunities to get involved. As we heard from our panelists during the very first webinar, it's critical that more perspectives are heard in these discussions. On October 14th, there's a meeting of the non-AMA Groundwater Committee. This fall, the Mojave and La Paz study committees are meeting monthly. They're chaired by Representative Cobb and have included discussion of potential future statewide legislation. Citizens from across the state are welcome to attend and even comment. The next meeting is October 27th at the Capitol. By joining this webinar, you will receive updates from Audubon's Western Rivers Action Network, and you might also consider signing up for updates from our Water for Arizona Coalition as well. and we'll do our best to keep you informed of these kinds of opportunities. You can sign up for that by clicking on the link in the chat, scrolling down to the bottom of the page. And I realize we are a couple minutes over, so I'm gonna stop there and just say thank you so much for your time, attention, and interest. And we're sorry that we're not able to take questions live, that we don't have time, but we've been compiling them and are going to address questions from all 3 webinars in a follow-up. So please also feel free to be in touch with us. And thank you again.